Keep those honeys hidden or I'll get a strategic advantage.
Oh.
I am creating a playable and show-accurate version of CardWars from Adventure Time. I'm going to give a recap, so don't worry if you haven't watched the other videos. I broke down the episodes that feature the game, using them to make a turn structure and combat system. They never show a mana mechanic, so because the first step in a turn is discard and draw, you only ever decrease the number of cards in your hand, since the only time you get new cards is when you're also getting rid of cards. I did playtesting with simple cards to test my combat system, which I thought worked pretty well. Between this video and the last one, we had a YouTube members live stream where we workshopped card ideas together in real time. I then cleaned up their wording in post and they went straight into the prototype, so you'll get to see these new cards throughout the video. We will now be doing these members live streams every Saturday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so if you'd like to help out, I'd really appreciate you becoming a member and making it so that I can keep working on this project full time. I playtested the game internally many times, and as I said in the previous video, it was working very well. With this functioning base game, I started plugging in new combat systems to see if anything worked better than what I had already designed. What I had already comes off as a little bit complicated, but essentially you can activate cards to put them in a state called battling. All battling cards in a land add up their damage, and the person receiving the damage can choose how it gets distributed between all their battling cards there. I spent a while writing up loose concepts for new battle systems, some that totally overhaul the mechanics, and others with only minor changes. These ideas were far from complete, but instead of fleshing them all out on paper, I can flesh them out in practice with my prototype. I'll go over the gist of a few of these concepts, then show you the relevant test footage. I tried a system very loosely inspired by Magic the Gathering, where you select an individual target to attack in a land, then the defender can choose to put other creatures there to block. This system was not too different from the pre-existing one, but it allowed you to pick your target and allowed defending creatures to take the brunt of entire attacks without worrying about the spillover damage. The first issue this system had was that, as I said, it was very similar to the pre-existing one. It also toned down the meaningfulness of grouping up your forces, since attacks can be stopped all at once, no matter how powerful. Also, in the pre-existing system, structures are always considered battling, and so players get a home field advantage by allowing players to distribute some of their damage to their structures. I tried some systems based on dice rolls back and forth, partially inspired by the Wandering Bald Man vs. Pig scene, which shall now be known as the WBMVPS, because it is referred to so often. First, I tried having each creature in a fight roll dice equal to their attack value, add up the total, and have the attacker deal the difference in rolls if theirs is higher. This didn't work because it made targeting creatures with higher attack values pointless because you'd never roll higher than them. Next, I tried a system where the attacker rolls 1d6 and does that damage, then the defender does the same, and they each go back and forth with a creature only getting to retaliate a number of times equal to their attack score, or until one dies. To start, this was too much damage for the stats on the cards, which could be changed, but then it wouldn't match up super well with the average stats we see in the show. It also meant the combat was really slow, which matters when there are multiple potential attacks declared and being resolved all at the same time. Next, we adapted the last test a little bit and made it so that each creature rolls 1d6, and whoever has the higher roll does their base attack damage to the target, going back and forth until one dies. This was also very slow to resolve and would require significant stat rebalancing. It also had the problem of breaking any creature with a low health value. If you have a creature with 10 attack and 2 health, and I attack it with my creature with 2 attack and 1 health, if I win the first roll, yours will die. This would limit options for card designs later down the line. Lastly, I tried a combat and positioning system based on the 2014 mobile game. Creatures are now confined to their side of the board, and making them attack targets whatever is directly opposite them in the opposing kingdom. These restrictions obviously invalidated a lot of the board positioning in the game, and because you can't attack the other player directly, creatures ended up just standing around a lot. We didn't playtest this one much because it was clearly not very good and not very fun. You might be asking, well Caleb, if you knew lots of these ideas were terrible, why even test them, you oaf? To which I'd say,
silence!
But actually, I believe most good ideas start out as bad ideas. I'm letting you look through the window here at my process on testing these things, but this is also my process for everything else in this project. It's not just difficult to design definitively good game mechanics on paper or in your head, it's impossible. So I made some simple ideas and then did the actual designing at the table. You might have noticed already, but all of these ideas I tested were bad. So I'm putting a pin in this combat stuff and going to continue using my original system. I know that's not a very satisfying or exciting conclusion to draw, but I'm not writing a story. Now, I've begun working on something you've all been waiting for. The economy. If you're not caught up, CardWars is stated to have commodity speculation, worker placement, and blind auctioning. Now, I could design all of these mechanics in isolation, making a unique function for each, but they all fall under the umbrella of economics. So the best solution would be to design a system which encompasses all three of those things. I have to be careful not to make this system too clunky, but also not so simple that it is no more than just making money and spending money on things. Not to mention, the economy has to tie into the rest of the game. I don't want it to be a separate minigame that you have to break away from the main game to engage with, but instead something woven cleanly into what I have already. Before I did my research, I decided to take a stab at implementing some sort of monetary system in the last playtest. I had arbitrarily put cards with a worker tag on them into the game earlier, so I wanted to see if I could make that function. The way I implemented it was that workers can floop when in a land with an allied building to generate 1 money. You take the top card of your deck and place it face up next to it. This card represents the 1 money that you have. Once you have 3 money, you can discard all those cards to draw a card without having to discard, which is significant since there is no other way to net gain cards. When you have money, you can also, instead of keeping it, draw one of your face-up cards when discarding and drawing instead of blindly from the deck. This gave the workers and money a double purpose, since the money could be used as more than just, well, money. The system was fine, but it was just a placeholder before I started looking at what the show actually had to offer about this. It's worth acknowledging that this is the first major mechanic I'm implementing that is not featured in the original CardWars episode. So, even though I want it to be integrated into the core of the game, I'll figure out a way to make it an optional mechanic in case people want show accuracy in terms of how we see the game played in the show, but not lore accuracy in terms of how the game is described to work in the show. As I just said, because the economy system is lore accurate without necessarily being show accurate, means the only information we get about these mechanics is that they exist, aside from these little visuals to go along with what Jake is saying. This is worker placement, this is blind auctioning. Cool. And this is commodity speculation. Very, very helpful, Steve Wolfhard and Adam Muto. Thank you for this grid that I now have to put in the game somehow to remain accurate. So beyond these snippets, I get to do whatever I want here, which is honestly pretty awesome. Here we go. I have decided this grid tile is called the economy board, and the yellow thingy on it is the economy tracker. The economy board, or EB, resembles a graph, however the axes are unlabeled. My initial impression is that this tracks some sort of value against time, but in order to maintain a level of simplicity, I wanted to avoid any possibility of having more than one of these boards present in a game, so I decided to use it to track the current game's economy as a whole. The grid is a chart with one axis representing each player. Movement along the grid represents how much the economy favors an individual player. I wanted to continue using face-up cards to represent money for the versatility I talked about, but as the amount of money being moved around increased, it became less viable to track it this way, so I just started using little yellow thingies. At first, I was leaning entirely into the commodity speculation aspect of things. My idea was that you would place money on cards you wanted to invest in, and then the economy would change somehow, so the value of your investments would fluctuate. Then the money could be used to buy more cards. This idea didn't get very far because it covered only the investment aspect of the economy and didn't link everything cohesively like I had wanted. It would require disconnected systems to make the economy fluctuate, so it was scrapped. I talked to my friend Grant about this a lot, since he knows how the not made up economy works, and I do not. We ended up crafting a system that bundles the commodity speculation and the blind auctioning together. The first pass had some flaws, but it was a start. A player could pay money to start an auction, in which case they would flip over the top card of their deck and the 2 players would bid on who gets it. Then, the winner of the auction could move the economy track 1 space orthogonally as they chose. It wasn't quite clear what it meant when the economy favored you, aside from the fact that only the player who is behind in the economy can force an auction. So the main thing here was that the player forcing an auction was flipping up a card from their own deck, which meant they only stood to lose from this exchange. If they won, they can move the economy tracker, but just get their own card back, and if the opponent wins, they get your card and to move the tracker. So we just reversed it. When you auction, you force the other player to flip up the top card on their deck, instead of your own. It took a bit to figure out what the economy board would really mean. I had the idea that when you're ahead in the economy, you can buy cards for money, and if you're further ahead, they become cheaper. So I laid out some numbers for cost, with these tiles meaning player 1 is ahead and can buy cards at the shown price, and these meaning the opposite. These tiles are neutral, so anyone can initiate an auction when the tracker is here. This tile is special in that when here, either player can buy a card for 4 money. But everything felt tipped to one side. If you got ahead in money, it was practically game set because you could stockpile to always outbid your opponent and keep buying cards. We threw around some alternative meanings for the numbers, like them being a limit on how high you could bid, but these didn't really fix the issue or felt out of place. We settled on a few things to keep one player from running away with all the money. 1, the loser of an auction keeps their money -1 instead of losing all the money they bid. This means if you're behind, you can't just be snuffed out over and over and over again. And 2, when a player spends money to buy a card, their opponent can move the economy tracker by 1. This means the leading player cannot buy cards endlessly if they have a huge surplus of money, since when they do so, the economy will shift back into the middle. Now, I know some of you are thinking, Caleb, the actual economy board doesn't have numbers on it. It's not show accurate. To which I say, silence! But also, if you really care, you can just play with a numberless one and remember the numbers yourself. I sort of glossed over how you actually get money, since I was more focused on explaining the balance of the economy. Simply, you floop any building and that places a money on it. When that building resets at the start of your next turn, you get that money. Creatures with the worker tag make it slightly more complicated. If a worker is in a land with an allied structure, it can floop instead of the structure to have the money put on it and not the structure. This is only really relevant because if the card with money on it dies, the money goes away with it. So if you'd rather the money be on the creature instead of the structure, you can floop the worker. If you floop both the worker and the structure in the same lane, you do not get 2 money. Instead, you get 1 money instantly without it going onto the cards first. This gave structures and non-aggressive creatures more meaning and value in the game, which changed the player's priorities considerably. While technically money wasn't an alternate win condition, being way ahead in the economy is an unignorable advantage. All 3 checkboxes have now been ticked. Worker placement to maximize income, blind auctioning meshed with commodity speculation, since those 2 things are already actually tied together conceptually. 2 players are forced to speculate on a given card's value to decide what to auction. And the final checkmark, this stupid grid thing. The game was no longer about just taking out the biggest offensive threat your opponent had. You now had to worry about not letting their income get out of hand, which also works in reverse, where you can prioritize defense for the same reason. We had a lot of fun, like usual, testing out this monetary system. It's definitely not perfect yet, and I've been noting lots of changes I want to make as I review the footage over and over. Mostly just balancing, but I'll list the things I think are wrong with the system at the moment. Things like structures need to have their health rebalanced. I'd like to figure out reasons why you wouldn't just floop all your buildings every turn to get money, or a way to restrict a constant flow of free income because it creates too many pieces on the board. I don't feel like the worker placement matters enough right now, given that it was something that was called out explicitly in the show, and I want there to be a way to battle the economy without money, so if you're not making an income, you can still do more than just break structures. Oh, and I almost forgot. Just kidding, this is scripted. I actually missed something in one of the clips. Jake moves the economy tracker from one corner to the middle. With the system I have in place, that would be an unbelievably pointless and bad move, but Jake has proven to be not very good at Card Wars, so I don't really care about that. The actual problem is the piece is moving diagonally, when my rules only ever allow it to move orthogonally. This will be something I figure out with all the other stuff I just listed. Unlike the combat system, I'm not going to outline the specific rules for the economy here, for 2 reasons. 1, it's not finished, and 2, big news, I'm going to be gearing up for a playtest soon. It's still going to be a little bit, because I'm going to have to finalize a lot of rules and write them out clearly enough that the game can be played without me present to be clarifying things constantly, which is harder than it sounds. When it's ready, members will get access to the playtests 1 week earlier than everyone else, but after that it will be entirely public. Unfortunately, the only way to distribute and play the game will be on Tabletop Simulator on Steam, which is not free. However, before the playtest, we'll be holding an Adventure Time trivia event in our Discord server, where 4 winners will get Steam keys for Tabletop Sim. More details on that will be posted later. You might know what time it is. Notes with my totally inspired and original OC Globulin. I had an idea where auction ties could be settled by liquidating assets on the board to make a deal, but it was deemed too out of nowhere and weird. A fairly popular suggestion we got in our last video was to make it so you have 5 cards every turn and draw back up to 5 at the start of your next turn. While it did add a chaotic element that is very welcome in Card Wars, it created a board that was far too complicated and overcrowded when it came to actual gameplay. I ended up thinking a lot more about factions than I should have. I said last time, but I want the lands themselves to have effects that tie directly into the strategies of the deck type. That means destroying lands or spreading them might become a strategy later on. I keep thinking about implementing a special move system in combat somehow, but those could be creature or element specific or potentially related to keywords. Like all creatures with a specific keyword could get access to an ability of some sort. They can't be super common because having too many would add on a ton of extra complexity to combat. The order of operations in combat became super complicated as we tested more. This reaction phase thing is surprisingly the most unique aspect of the game because it allows a ton of player freedom even on the opponent's turn. But that means figuring out what can happen and in what order gets really muddy. Also, I cleaned up the presentation of the board for our internal playtesting, so it's a bit clearer and nicer to look at. I didn't have as many notes as usual, so I'm sorry Globulin, but that means you have to go back. During the making of this video, I reached out in the Discord forums for suggestions on alternate combat systems to test out. I appreciate you guys for getting back to me with a bunch of responses which gave me inspiration for some of the ideas I tested. I'm working as hard as I can on this project, so if you'd like to support me, I'd really appreciate it if you became a member. And, liking and subscribing. I wouldn't be asking if it didn't mean a lot to me. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe and click that bell.